Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 294, Reopening the All-State Debate. Should reading be assessed for school honor choirs? We are revisiting a topic today to bring in more perspectives. Dave Ritschard teaches choir in Alabama, where they are considering adding sight reading to the all-state choir audition. In some states, arguments are spinning about removing sight reading, and some places like Alabama apparently want to add it, which tells me that this is really not a settled issue, and there are really well-meaning arguments on both sides of it. Dave is opposed to adding sight reading in Alabama, and he made a post on Facebook recently that piqued my interest, and I had a conversation with him there and invited him here to have more of an in-depth, nuanced conversation about this topic. So today we are diving headfirst into a hot-button issue that has blown up on Facebook and on this show many times. What is the true purpose of an all-state choir? Is it a reward reserved strictly for the pinnacle of high school achievement, or is it a spark meant to transform smaller music programs from the bottom up? Joining me to parse out this classic debate is Dave Ritschard, a choral and drama director at a school in Marshall County, Alabama. Dave brings a unique perspective centered on student access. This perspective bumps up against mine in some friendly back and forth. He recently went public with his concerns over Alabama Vocal Association's plan to add a required sight reading component to auditions, arguing that it creates a massive equity issue for rural programs where students receive zero elementary music education. I, of course, hold a different view, also citing my own equity concerns, which sets the stage for an incredibly honest and constructive clash over the fine line between defending musical excellence and accidental gatekeeping. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registration simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. Ensemble trips can be more than just a performance. They can build community, inspire artistry, and give students a reason to stay invested. That's why I recommend Kaleidoscope Adventures. For more than 30 years, Kaleidoscope has helped student groups travel with purpose, combining performance opportunities with experiences that deepen musical understanding and create lifelong memories. They'll help you find the right destination, the right venue, and the right balance of music, education, and fun. And they manage the planning from start to finish so you can focus on your job as an educator. To explore options for your choir, visit mykatrip.com or find the link in the show notes. A big shout out goes to the producers and Inner Circle over at the Patreon page. These are folks that are really dedicated to keeping the lights on here at this show. Venture Studios, Chandler Smith, Brian Long, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, Steve and Kathy Kakachik, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, Angie Schilling, Rebecca Chalk, RJ McCracken, Michael Shimp, and Kyle Siddons. I'm here with Dave Ritschard. We're going to be discussing a topic that comes up pretty regularly with music educators, and especially choral music educators, of whether or not we should be assessing a student's ability to read music when we are selecting for all-state choirs. And we might expand over the course of our conversation a little bit to include other types of honor choir experiences, because we all know all-state means different things in many different places of how those events function. So I'm excited to dig into this conversation. It's a passion topic of mine. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And I really appreciate you kind of giving a voice to younger teachers. I've seen you do this before. And I really appreciate that. I've listened to your podcast for quite a while now. So I appreciate you having me on, even though I'm not a expert teacher or I haven't been teaching for that long. So I really appreciate that.
Well, all I hear you saying is that you're calling me old. That's what I took out of that.
Experienced.
Yeah, there you go. We'll go with that. Okay, so Dave, first of all, before we get into the meat of this conversation, why don't you tell us about who you are? Where do you do what you do, and kind of what got you into it?
Sure. So I grew up in Papua New Guinea as a missionary kid. I spent my From the age of 5 to 18, from when I graduated high school, I lived in Papua New Guinea, and I attended a small private school there, a Christian private school, and I actually didn't get involved in music until ninth grade. I have a very musical family. My mom is very musical, her background is, and as growing up, I kind of was resistant to her helping me just because she was my mom and I didn't do well taking lessons from her.
Sure.
So I actually didn't get involved in music till ninth grade, and I started out in band. So I did band ninth and 10th grade. 11th grade, we were on furlough, so there was pretty much no music instruction. And then 12th grade was the first time I joined choir, and I just loved it. I got a solo my first semester in choir. I was the only tenor who could really kind of sing that solo. And I got it, and I was just hooked since then. And I also got the lead role in Pirates of Penzance. I played Frederick, and that kind of gave me a love for musical theater as well. Ever since I was 8, I really wanted to be a pediatric cardiovascular surgeon. That was where I was headed.
Interesting.
I had put that as my major. I was dead set on that for about 10 years. And my senior year, I got the opportunity to do all those things, and then also my choir teacher allowed me to teach a small ensemble and conduct. And I say conduct because she literally told the percussionist, she said, don't look at him. She said, don't look at him because he's new. He doesn't know what he's doing. So you just keep the beat, and he's going to be up there keeping the beat with his hands. So, but she gave me a lot of great opportunities. And then before I started college, I changed my major to music education, and I was going to go the performance route. And then my dad talked some sense into me, and he says, hey, do something if you want to go performance afterwards, but get the music education. It's a more marketable degree, which I'm very grateful for. And when I graduated high school, I attended my first 3 years of college at Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, and then which is another private Christian school. And then after my third year, it got too expensive, and I transferred to Jacksonville State University. Some of my credits didn't transfer, so I ended up extending my stay there by about 3 years. So it took me about 6 years to get out of college. And now I currently teach in Douglas, Alabama, which is in Marshall County. It's a smaller school, 5A. And this is my first year teaching choir full time. I graduated not December before this most recent December, and I taught strings for a semester. I did a maternity leave for someone, and taught strings for a semester, which was way outside of my wheelhouse, but that was a lot of fun too. And I teach drama. Yeah. I teach 6 through 12 drama and choir.
Okay, so when you teach, how much of your day is choir and how much of your day is drama?
So drama, I only have one period. So the first 3 periods of my day are middle school. I have 7th, 6th, and then 8th. And then high school, planning, theater, choir is how my day goes. Interesting. So let's kind of, I think, frame the conversation this way. The reason we're having this conversation is you made a post on Facebook not too long ago, kind of expressing a view that you hold, which is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I've got it here in front of me, I'm just going to summarize it, that the Alabama Vocal Association, which I'm assuming would be the governing body in your state that covers all state choir in Alabama, is considering adding a sight reading component to the all-state audition process. And you don't think that they should. And you made this post, and I think most of the people in the audience will already know that I probably disagree with you about this, but that's what makes this conversation fun. So I want you to kind of put it in your words first of like, why do you oppose adding this component to the all-state choir audition? Sure. And I would like to say there was a lot of really good comments opposing me, and quite a few in agreement. There were some notable names in agreement, some notable composers, and then also some notable names in disagreement, you included. And reading over those and kind of doing some research, I would say my view has perhaps softened, and I would maybe word it a little differently than my post originally, just because, some people made some good points. And I think as I was kind of taking notes and going over how I would like to kind of express what I think in my post, I really emphasized the equity issue and making it an equitable experience, kind of focusing on how some students don't have elementary music education. So here in our system, the first time kids are exposed to music is 6th grade, and they can choose either band or choir. And choir, they rotate out every 9 weeks. Band's not that way. I'm fighting to kind of change that, but it's a battle. Now, they can choose to stay all year, and I had lots of 6th graders choose to stay all year this year. So I think I approached it from much more of the equity standpoint in my post. And as I've kind of gotten ready for this podcast, I think I would more frame it from what is the purpose of All-State, first of all, and then what skills are necessary in All-State. What does All-State look like? What does the 3-day weekend where they're working with the clinicians look like? And what skills are we evaluating so that we're picking the best musicians for that weekend, if that makes sense. So I think my kind of thesis would be, at least in Alabama, there is no sight reading of any kind at the festival itself. They have all their music. They get their music like in September, I think. And then auditions are in November. And the All-State Festival is in March. So there shouldn't be any sight reading at that point. You know, they should know their music. Most kids usually have their music memorized. So I think what I would say is sight reading, and, you know, let me say this on the outset. So all the music literacy advocates, which I would consider myself one as well, don't rake me over the coals. Sight reading is so important. Being a literate musician is so important. And I do sight reading every day in my class. And I'm next year, I'm even planning to upgrade to the sight reading factory where the students can individually assess themselves, and I'm going to make that part of my curriculum. So I think music literacy is of paramount. It's an essential skill in music. And so that being said, I do not find it to be something that is used particularly at the All-State Festival. So I don't see the necessity in making that a part of the audition process. And then, of course, I still stand by the equity issues I raised in my post. And I think there are much more relevant skills for the All-State Festival, such as, can the student respond to instruction in the moment? Can this student blend well? And I know blend is kind of a controversial word, but can this student interact well with others? Can they match vowels? Can they cut off at the right time? And I think those are more applicable skills at the All-State Festival itself.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, I would consider all those things related to music reading, which is probably where some of those perspectives would differ. So one of the things that sticks out to me about your setup there for this is that I think my biggest quibble then would be the way your All-State Festival is set up. Because
I figured you might say that.
Yeah, because if there is no reason for a student to be able to read music during the festival process itself, then I would say that that's the flaw that deserves to be criticized. Because being able to read music is such a core skill for the art form of choral music, specifically, not for all music, which is what people love to conflate this to me when I make this argument. But some musicians don't read music. Oh, yes, correct. They don't. But in choral music, specifically, which is what we're talking about, it's a core skill. And so, for example, one of the things that I would say is not a great learning opportunity for kids, or not a great simulation of real-world choral skill, is to show up to a festival with all of their notes and rhythms totally memorized already. Because that in my mind takes away from the clinician. As somebody who's been a clinician, that's one of my least favorite types of clinics to do, because I feel like when I finally show up, there's no more art to be made, because they've got this like total ingrained version. For example, I would love it if I could look at an honor choir in front of me and say, okay, I need 6 people to jump from the alto 2 to the alto 1 part because we have a balance problem. And that might not happen until the day of. And if you can't read music, yikes, those types of things. And so those are kind of real world issues. Now, one thing I want to get your reaction to, because you mentioned the softening some of your view, but also sticking to the equity concern. One of the things you wrote in your post is that you have a concern with how adding reading would affect students from systems that don't have the same opportunities and resources as others. And it's interesting because in many conversations I've had about this topic with folks, my concern is also equity based. And the way I would frame that is to say that if we don't include that skill, then the schools that are not teaching those things to students now get a pass, and they get to then show that they are doing the art form and they're doing the education at the highest level, because they get to put on their Instagram that they have all these all-staters in Alabama, even though they are not teaching those kids those things, and then it never changes. And you've mentioned that you still teach it, but my concern is not with teachers who still teach it, it's the ones who don't. And then those kids never get that opportunity because there's no internal pressure from their system and from their administrators to add that skill to the process. Thoughts?
And see, I agree with you, and I figured that would be something that would come up, and I think I would take that exact thing and kind of argue my side, and I would say I feel like punishing the students for a failure of the teacher. And I think that teachers absolutely need to be teaching sight reading, and there does need to be some accountability for that. And I think one thing that is lacking in Alabama is that accountability that, like in Texas, they have I think it's called the UIL, where they evaluate teachers, and then admin will often look at that to determine if they're going to invite teachers back. So that would be actually part of if a student is going to, if a teacher is going to be invited back. And I like that. I think that should be, I'm sorry, there's something going on with. But anyways, I think there should be more oversight that holds teachers accountable. But I think that Allstate, if we're making that an evaluation for the students, that's punishing the students for a failure on the teacher's part.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because I understand why you would come to that conclusion. I think my concern with that line of thinking of that it is punishing the student and therefore we shouldn't assess the skill. I think that's my through line that I would have trouble with. Because if we apply that same line of reasoning to almost anything taught at school, that a kid has to know X in order to go on to YZ elite opportunity, whether it's to get into Harvard or to get into medical school or whatever it is, and then we were to say, well, because some kids don't get taught those things, they should just get to go to Harvard? Or because some kids don't get taught those things, they should just get a free pass into medical school. We don't want to punish the kid. They should just get whatever they want. To me, my question at that point would be, where does that end? And at what point does the accountability for the school system be? In other words, why is our thought process not, hey, that choir teacher in that school system that's not teaching kids how to read, they're the ones punishing students, not the Alabama All-State Choir. They're not punishing students. Their teachers are. That would be, so to me, it's where is the locus of control? And this probably could be part of our conversation too of what Allstate is for, which is something I know is on our list to talk about. And so that would be my concern. Is I see students being punished too, which is why my equity issue is kind of just comes from the different perspective. I just don't see the Allstate Choir as being the one who's punishing them. I think that's their school systems.
I see that point, and I think that's a really good point. And I think I would push back a little bit on the. You brought up Harvard, and if a student doesn't have those skills and they still make it to Harvard, I would distinguish a little bit between mathematics and English and those as opposed to an art form like music. And I think part of what I would say is you're not. We talked about how there's great musicians who don't read music. You're not going to see great mathematicians who can't write or read. So not that I know of. So I think. I would make a little bit of a distinction in that regard, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think that's kind of where my disclaimer earlier in the conversation is that I agree with you if we're expanding the conversation, the definition of what All-State Choir is to include trying to find and recognize the best all-around musicians in the state of Alabama. I just would disagree that that's the point of an all-state choir. To me, you're trying to find the best all-around choral musicians in the state of Alabama to make the best all-state choir that you can make, because somebody's ability to be a studio musician and play the guitar by ear is not a super applicable skill in a choral rehearsal. So that, I think that's where so maybe that's where we should go next, is what is the point of all-state choir? And I think this is where I definitely have had enough conversations with folks to have some humility here to recognize that all-state choir in my state of Missouri does not occupy the same space as it does in other states. And so one of the things I recognize I'm fortunate in Missouri, where the Missouri All-State Choir is a big deal. It's very, very difficult to get into here. However, for a kid who doesn't make it into the All-State Choir, of which I was one, by the way, I never made my All-State Choir here in Missouri because it's hard. Like, it was really, really hard, and I was not prepared for the audition, partly because I couldn't sight read well enough. But that's a whole different story. But even for kids like me who didn't make the All-State Choir in Missouri, there are also a ton of other mountaintop choir experiences that we could do. We have honor choirs all over the state. We have festival choirs. We have community organizations, all these types of things. There are other opportunities. And I recognize that for some schools and some kids and programs, the All-State Choir is the only one. Like, if I don't get my kid into the All-State Choir, they might not have any chances to do any cool things, which I think you kind of mentioned.
Yes.
In your post, is that for your students, or for many of your students, All-State might be one of the only chances to sing in something like this. And so to me, that's one of the bigger reasons why some of us might have different perspectives on this. Thoughts about that?
No, absolutely. And I think, for example, and I think I mentioned this in my post, the highest level of performance that I can give these students is singing in our lunchroom. And I know the argument of, hey, it's not the venue, it's the students, and I agree with that to a certain degree. But sure. I think we could agree that, at least for me, some of my most meaningful experiences, part of that was the venue I sang in. I got to sing at Carnegie Hall, and there's a difference between that and singing in a lunchroom. Somewhere designed specifically for choral music to be sung, for music, and I mean even at the all-state level. So that is certainly a large part of my argument is, for some of these kids that are very dedicated musicians, All-State is one of their few, if only, opportunities that I can give them immediately. And I would like to build up the program to the point where we're traveling more, going to nicer establishments. But for the immediate future, the next few years, that's certainly the only, or at least the top musical experience that my dedicated students can have, because sixth grade, they sort of get to choose, kind of. And I say kind of because classes fill up, and my room is one of the biggest rooms. So I had 65 sixth graders last semester, which, by the way, 62 decided to stay next year. So that was a huge win for me this year. Very grateful for that. But there's a lot of students that don't want to be in there, or want to be in there for the wrong reasons, or want to be in there but aren't willing to put in the work. And All-State is one of the ways that I feel my students that are very dedicated can have that experience. Now, I can hear the pushback being, well, hey, if they're dedicated musicians, then they're going to learn to sight read. And I would agree with that.
If you haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom, because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more. And then the work we do in the classroom can be customized to what they need in the music and the repertoire they're learning, and it can be customized to their current learning level as a group. So use the Choralosophy checkout code, Choralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home.
And they will. But I think sight reading is one of the most intimidating things for choral musicians.
And I would say not if it's taught well.
Okay.
Honestly.
Yeah.
Honestly. I think that is one of the biggest cruxes of this whole conversation. Is I think that many have the impression that sight reading is a very intimidating thing for kids, which is why I work so hard on this platform to help my colleagues do it better, because it is not intimidating for my kids. And that's something that took me years and years and years to build. Even the ones that aren't like amazing at it, it's just not a scary thing for them. Because of the way it's taught and the way it's implemented. So my concern with taking that as a reason for not assessing it, again, kicks the can down the road in my view. It takes what I think is a lot of very common mythology about who can read music and who can't, and reinforces an inequity by us continuing to say things like only certain kids can. And And I think that that's where the responsibility falls on the educators. Now, in your situation, it's interesting because you finished year one, correct, at your school? Yeah.
Yes.
So I would posit a guess, because I know that because you teach these things, if we were to fast forward this conversation 3 or 4 years from now, I don't think that you would still be having kids who would tell you that if they add this, I'm not going to try out, for example. Because I saw that in your post. I bet you just won't have those kids 3 or 4 years from now. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. And I guess my thing is, well, that's 3 years of kids. That's my concern is, and I think that's part of another part of the argument is I would say Alabama's not ready for it yet, for sure. If that
How will
makes
they
sense.
get ready?
Yeah. And again, I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying of more teacher accountability. And I think, but I just don't see Allstate as being the teacher accountability. I think, I know of a lot of programs around here where the teachers are kind of teaching choir like a general music class. They're doing lots of written assignments. They're doing, a lot of playing everything on the piano for the students, which I know you're an advocate against, which I agree with you there. And I think that there needs to be some sort of more teacher oversight in the choral world where teachers like that are being evaluated on that basis, because an admin might walk into a choral classroom where the teacher's doing all of the things I was saying, lots of written assignments, lots of, bell ringers, and sitting there playing the piano and singing with the students, getting them to sing along. And they might see that and be like, oh, look at that. The students are engaged. The students are having fun or learning from their perspective. But I feel like you might walk into that room, and I would certainly walk into a room like that and say, yeah, this isn't how choir should be. Choir shouldn't be the teacher just sitting there playing everything on the piano. There shouldn't be a ton of written assignments. There should be a lot of singing. There should be a lot of learning how to read music. There should be a lot of that going on. So I think I would be an advocate for teacher accountability, and I don't know exactly how that would look like, but that would be something I would push back on. And but I also see your point in that would be a great way to bring a teacher, it would eventually bring teacher accountability if students that are not doing these things in their programs or not being taught this by their teachers stop making Allstate. So I think that's kind of how I would respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, my thought would be that there's never a better time to start these things than tomorrow. And my first thought too, I wonder what you would think about this, is if you recognize or would recognize the power of our state organizations to use their bully pulpit to set agendas of what's important to teach kids, because that's kind of one of the reasons that I take the position that I do, is I see that as a pretty big deal in terms of not just your students, but the students of all of our states, is that our state organizations have quite a bit of power in setting the agenda for a variety of these things. And yes, you might have some short-term situations where kids say, well, I don't know how to do this, so I'm not going to try out. But I wonder if that could be outweighed by however many years go by with however many schools that aren't teaching these types of things, but then start to make adjustments because they want to have their students be successful at these events. And does that not outweigh what I would consider a bigger equity concern, which is school districts all over the country not teaching these skills? To me, that's a much bigger equity concern than those tiny fraction of kids that ever make an all-state choir. I'm more interested in how it impacts the big picture, the bigger slices of the pie. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I definitely agree to a certain point, and I think so. Let me get this correct. You're kind of saying, a couple rough years and then things improve. Is that kind of what it would boil down to?
In some people's situations, sure.
And I guess I would like to see the improvement that you're talking about in the general sight reading in the classroom, but I would like to see it happen in a way that doesn't eliminate some students that would have otherwise made Allstate. Now, I still hold to my premise that I don't think Allstate should be part of our auditions, but I see it happening regardless. So that would kind of be my compromise or caveat that I would add is, okay, sure, let's add it, but let's be very careful with how we add it over the next few years, so that the students who are in programs who historically have not gotten the proper sight reading instruction are not eliminated from making All-State. Does that make sense? So like, and I know actually, and I need to say this in defense of AVA, because I certainly don't want it to seem like I'm really hating on AVA. I do think there are some problems, but I think that's true with any governing board. But they are just making it a trial run this year, and they're planning on implementing it next year. So I do appreciate that compromise that they're willing to give us. So did that answer the question?
It did. I'm just seeing if you recognize or how you feel about the concept that what they do choose to do with the in your case at AVA, what they do choose to do has a powerful impact on what happens in classrooms across your whole state.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and I think I listened recently to your episode of like the gatekeeping, the gatekeeping episode that you had, and there were some things in that, like, you know, you're right. They do have that kind of gatekeeping ability for these experiences based on how they run auditions, and I think of, and kind of going back to what we think of what the purpose of All-State is, because I don't think we've like hit on that directly.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I would say that All-State is also a recruitment tool, and I don't just see it, and I say specifically don't just, because I also do see it as this, but I don't just see it as recognizing the students that do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I also see it as, for programs like mine, like I said, that is one of the few high musical experiences that my program currently can offer. I see it as kind of a recruitment tool where students experience it, come back, tell others, and building it that way. Now, again, I would hasten to add, that doesn't mean we should let students in that won't function well at All-State. But I don't just see it as, you know, here's all these extremely scholastic musicians, or, I see more to All-State and honor choir. I don't just see it as that, but as a recruitment tool and something that can be used in smaller programs to kind of promote what I think choir should be, or the high musical experience that these students can experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now that is interesting, because I have seen people in comment sections in posts like yours, but also others that raise this issue, and it always perplexes me. And a part of it could be that my conception of what All-State is for is very, very different than what you just described. And one of those comments that I see a lot is, if we add these rigorous components like sight reading or even tonal memory, I've seen people opposed to it for that type of thing. And then some of the kids that I have that just started choir wouldn't be able to do it yet. And that flummoxes me, because in my mind, All-State choir is not something for beginners. All-State choir is a mountaintop within the art form at the high school level. To me, like, similar to, I can't imagine, maybe this is partly my sports background as well, but I can't imagine football coaches in my state getting together to argue about why there aren't more freshmen on the All-State football list, or why there aren't more kids who never played football before junior year that get recognized as All-State football players. To me, All-State is, for any activity in a high school, is a representation of the people who have reached the pinnacle of that activity, and in whatever way they choose to recognize it. So football is usually just like a list. They don't have a football game for All-State in my state anyway, but for choir, there is actually a performance, and it represents a structure where a very rigorous audition happens in my state, where the people who score the best from all those areas get to go and do the All-State. And there is no way on earth that a beginner would ever even crack it into the top group. And so that, for me, I don't really see All-State as a recruiting tool for that reason, because in Missouri, we don't even allow freshmen and sophomores to try out. It's an 11th and 12th graders only kind of a thing. And so my kids, the way I think of it is, they're not going to be ready for an All-State audition even, let alone to make it, until they've been in my class for 2 or 3 years. So that's just such a huge different perspective. I think that's what causes probably some of these disagreements. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's interesting. I didn't know that about Missouri All-State. So they don't have a middle school All-State choir?
Not in Missouri. We have like I said, we have other things
Yeah.
that are similar to that, but we don't call them all state. So there are state level honor choirs. They're usually run by ACDA, where you just send in a recording, basically. So that's the only audition component. Our all state choir, and this is actually something I want to ask you about too, because
Sure.
in Missouri, our all state choir, the sight reading represents, let me do some quick math. I highlighted this once
You
already,
said
but
24 points.
yeah, 24 points out of 174 points
Yeah.
total. And so to me, I actually think that's great, because it is not the only thing, and it's not even a majority of the thing, but it's in there. It's one, and it sends a signal to the teachers that that is one of the skills that you're going to have to teach. You're also going to have to teach them vocal technique. You're also going to have to teach them to recognize a key signature. You're also going to have to teach, there's all these things.
Right.
And then in order to prepare for that, then we're giving a pretty comprehensive education to kids to get ready for that.
Sure. Yeah. Again, I see, if I could flip a switch and my program was, what I want it to be, then my students would all be comfortable with sight reading, and that would be, and I know it takes time, and I've already seen huge growth in my program, and I'm very grateful for that. So I see the point, and I think I would just say again, going back to, we don't have those honor choir. I think we do have one honor choir, which I'll look into more this year. But there's just not a lot of things like that here in Alabama. It's pretty much all state, and then we have state choral performance assessment, and that was something I mentioned as well in my post. State choral performance assessment, we do evaluate sight reading, and I think that's great, because that is teacher accountability. So for me, we sing our set, and then we go to sight reading. So the way I see it is, the set is the students and me kind of getting graded together. A little bit more on them. Are they prepared? And then sight reading is really an evaluation of me. Have I done a good job teaching them? And that's actually, I don't know how it is in Missouri, but a large part of the sight reading score is actually the pedagogy of the teacher itself. Like that's actually scored. Like, did the teacher explain it well? Did they break it down in a way that made sense? Did they, point out, because you get 2 tries, and then you can give them suggestions, and then you do it again. So part of the evaluation is, did the teacher teach this in a way that made sense to the students? And we're actually graded on that, which I love. And I think,
That's great.
Yeah, I think before, so here might be an interesting compromise. Before requiring sight reading in auditions, I would almost like to see SCPA, State Core Performance Assessment, becoming a requirement for teachers here first. And I know that that's probably a very hot take, and I definitely could be convinced otherwise, but I guess that's something I would like to see happen before sight reading at all state, because that to me is more of holding the teachers accountable to be teaching that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think if I understand you correctly, what you're suggesting would be like in order for your students to audition for all state, they have to have participated in this other event. Is that what you mean?
I think that's one way that it could happen, because we do have SCPA before we have all state auditions.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, that would kind of, I could see the pushback being, well, you just said, I just said that that's punishing for students for something out of their control, and that could be something out of their control as well. So
Right.
I guess I would just push for more teacher accountability that doesn't say, okay, well, give it 3 years, and then you'll have students that'll start making it to all state because you finally started teaching sight reading. Yeah, and so we also have a middle school all state choir, and we have middle school treble, middle school mixed, high school SSAA, high school TTBB, and high school SATB. So there are quite a few choirs. So, and I could see a compromise being, hey, let's not assess sight reading at the middle school level, and let's start assessing it at the high school level. And that's something that I think would be a wonderful compromise. And then one thing I did want to get into,
and I would agree with that.
Go
I
ahead.
would agree with that, by the way. I just want to throw that in there. I would agree with you there. I don't know that I would have a strong opinion either way about middle school all state,
Sure.
to be honest, because
So, and I think,
because it comes to the like, what is all state for? To me, when I think of what is all state for, I'm thinking about the upper level. Like,
Sure.
what is it for at that level? Right? What is it for at the middle school level? I could be convinced of all kinds of things it's for. It could be more of a recruiting thing at that point, which is great.
well, and I think that would be a compromise that I would push for. And this is a conversation that I'm certainly going to bring to the AVA board.
Yeah.
And there's kind of two things that I'd like to get your thoughts on. They are talking of evaluating sight reading with Sight Reading Factory, which I have a huge problem with that. So they're planning to, the kids go into a room and the adjudicator pulls up the sight reading example, gives them a starting pitch, and then they record it, and then the Sight Reading Factory AI gives them a score. And I have a huge problem with that. And I think, I heard you address at at one point, so I think you might agree with me. Well, I know you'd agree with me that a student could miss a ton of notes and still be considered a good sight reader, in that they could sing the rhythms correctly, they could have all the correct solfege, they could perhaps migrate on their do, but still get intervals correct. And I know that was something even at the collegiate level, when we were evaluated on our sight reading. I know one time I lost do, but with my new do, I had the correct intervals, and so I still didn't bomb the assessment because it was a live human saying, okay, yeah, you migrated do, but you still, from there, you got your intervals correct. Whereas if we're using Sight Reading Factory AI, it's, you didn't sing the note correct, you're marked off for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. Obviously, I'm a big Sight Reading Factory pusher.
Yeah, I love Sight Reading Factory.
Yes, and I love it, and I have shared with them some of my concerns with the auto assessment. Although they have done some amazing things to partly to respond to my concerns about that as they were putting the program out there. So I think it is a really good tool, and I use it. Although I would agree with you that I would not want to use it to assess an all-state audition, but even for different reasons. So, for example, my biggest concern with using it in an all-state audition is that I think it's only fair that every single singer in the audition reads the exact same exercise.
Yes.
For example, I don't even want them all reading a level 3 that's going to refresh every time, but because they're like, yeah, they're all at, like, if level 3 is a certain level of difficulty, but they're not all exactly the same. And and some kid could get an easier exercise than someone else, and then you have a fairness issue. And so I would prefer a pre-printed, if they're going to use Sight Reading Factory, I think that's fine, but I think they should have a live human, and I think they should, being the judge, and it should be all the same. Everybody reads the exact same exercise, because then they're actually comparing apples to apples in terms of who read what. And now the assessment software itself that does that work, I think that can give a pretty fair assessment. But my actual concern would be that not everybody would be able to then read the exact same exercise unless they have something worked out with Sight Reading Factory directly.
Maybe, yeah.
Where and they could. I'm sure that technology that would exist if they asked for it. Where, like, hey, but we need to make sure when we refresh it that it's the same exercise every single time.
Sure. Can I ask you something? Let's say I just kind of want to get your thoughts on, let's say a student starts singing the sight reading exercise. They start on do and they go a half step low, and then they're in a new key, basically. Like, let's say they've changed keys, but then from then on they get the intervals correctly. So let's say you're assessing that student. How would you assess them? What kind of grade would you give them?
Yeah, so I would point out that when I assess my students in class, that's not an all-state audition. I'm doing it for I'm doing it for different reasons. In other words, if I'm working, because I assess kids individually on Sight Reading Factory with live humans in the room, we do it multiple times a year, one-on-one, from the beginning of 9th grade all the way to 12th grade. And so I am not auditioning a kid for all-state choir when they do their first pretest with me. And so there's all kinds of things that I'm able to do to give a male changing voice, for example, a shifting key center so that they can actually stay in the right key and not gravitate their pitch very much, those types of things. But because of my conception of what all-state choir is, I would expect that my kids that are ready for that audition aren't going to slip out of the key. And they don't. They would not make all-state choir in Missouri if they sang the whole exercise correctly but in the wrong key. It would just be counted all wrong, even by a live human.
Interesting. See, I think I would just disagree with an assessment like that. I think I would, if I was evaluating my students on sight reading and they migrated, now if they're all over the place, obviously if they can't, carry a tune in a bucket, that's one thing. But if the nerves get them, and I know it's happened to me, I tend to sing flat when I'm nervous, and they migrated do, I'm not going to mark them as a 0. I would definitely take off some points, but I think I would be like, okay, well, you got the intervals correct from then on. And so I think that using that, I would tie it back and say, I think using AI to evaluate all state auditions is a huge issue for me. And I think, just the audition process in general, I have some big problems with. And I know I'm a first year and I probably shouldn't have problems with things, but
it's okay to have problems with things.
I'm a rather combative person sometimes, in that I don't. And that was something I kind of wanted to address. Is I'm also in the theater world, so I also attend Trumbauer Festival, and there is a huge difference between a room full of theater teachers and a room full of choral teachers, which I find very interesting. The theater teachers, and I don't know if it's the same in your state, but when we get a room full of choir teachers, it's very professional, very subdued, or and I say professional with kind of quotes, but very speak when it's your turn to speak, very subdued. As opposed to a room full of theater teachers, they're all advocating aggressively for their programs. I mean, people are standing up, they're talking across the room at each other, and there's one local theater teacher and everybody calls her the bulldog, because if she has an opinion that she thinks is going to help her students and make things more equitable or whatever, she is going to make that heard. And I appreciate that to a certain degree, and that's something that I would like to see a little bit more in the choral world or at least in the choral world here, because I don't know if it's the same way everywhere else, of some of these decisions being a little more inclusive, the conversations being a little more inclusive, and allowing for some differing opinions, rather than here's what the board's decided, give us your thoughts, but we've already decided it. I have a problem with that, because
Sure.
I think, and I want to be careful with how I say this, but a lot of the decisions, and this is something, I have some of these comments pulled up. This is something a good friend of mine who taught here for 3 or 4 years and now teaches in Florida brought up, that the why is often missing in these conversations, and that was something that I still haven't heard. He was bringing up the point of the why has not been significantly addressed, but then also so many of the decisions in Alabama, at least, are made by, it feels like, they're made by more affluent school systems, and those tend to be the board members, and I know there's probably exceptions, so I'm not trying to make a blanket statement, and I'm not trying to say anything against anybody in particular, and I've met many board members. I appreciate what they do, and I think they're great people. I would like to see smaller programs such as mine, more rural programs that look very different from other programs. A lot of programs have everybody in the room has chosen to be there, and that's not the case here at all. They give me, so kind of going back to, like I said, I had 65 sixth graders this year. I really recruited hard. I brought them to SCPA. They loved SCPA. And 62 of them decided to stay, or 63. And when I went and spoke with the counselor about it, I told him the number, and he went and did some calculations. He's like, okay, yeah, I won't have to put anybody else in your class. And I'm kind of sitting there like, 63 students, and you're still wondering if you need to throw some other students in my class. And then we got to rising 8th graders, and he's like, I should be able to cap it at 15 students. So that means I'm going to have 30 students that want to be there, and they're going to put 15 students in that don't want to be there. And that's true in every class that I teach. There is not a select group at any point. And so it's much harder for a program like mine to get that progression. And that's something I need to advocate, I know, at my school. And I have great admin, fantastic admin at the high school, and they work with me on stuff like that. But at the same time, their hands are tied to a certain degree because there's not a lot of electives at our school. So I end up getting a bunch of kids who don't want to be in there. And so kind of tying it back, I feel like a lot of the conversation is had by school where students are choosing to be there, or the program is built up already to the point where they are not dealing with students who don't want to be in the room, because that is a very, and I've won lots of students over, and choir's great and it wins students over, but it's every class I had, there was at least one student who didn't want to be in there, and they make it obvious. So I think the conversation needs to include, and I appreciate you bringing me on, include programs more like that, because I feel like what often happens with rural programs such as this is you either get teachers that use a program like this as kind of a stepping stone, where they teach 3 years here until a better job opens up, and then they go there, or you get teachers who realize what it is and kind of stop pushing for it to be a more advanced program. Does that make sense? I want to make sure I word that carefully.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that I'll throw in here too is, and this is just a suggestion maybe as you continue to have conversations there in Alabama, is, and I don't think what we do here in Missouri is perfect necessarily, but I think for all state, I do appreciate several of the attempts that we've made in our state to not only have it be a rigorous opportunity that is very difficult to attain, which I do think is important for all state, but to also make some inclusive gestures as well. And one of the ways we do that is we audition by region. So each region is guaranteed a certain number of spots. In other words, if there are some places in the more rural areas, to address like your concern, where if we were to really compete against everyone across the whole state, then you would see an all state that is centralized in the bigger affluent areas. You absolutely would. And then the
Yes.
rural schools wouldn't have any representation. And so we kind of solved some of that problem by everybody still has to do the same audition, but you're not competing against each other's scores. You're competing against, so in your case, might be like the schools in your county or the 2 or 3 counties around you,
Sure.
or whatever it is that your state were to come up with as a system. They still have to sight read. They still have to do the solo or whatever it is that's part of the audition, or sing the audition song or whatever it is, but they're not competing against the kids in the college town. They're not competing against the kids at the big suburban high school. They're competing against more like schools, and every group gets an allocation, almost like a representative government. That's
Sure.
kind of how we have it there. So that's just a thought.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate how that could solve some of the issues, but I would even push back and say, Marshall County alone, where we are, 12 minutes down the road is a city school, and it is, just night and day difference. They have a fine arts building that's millions of dollars. They have professional mic setups. They have a backdrop screen in their theater that's $80,000. So just 12 minutes down the road, the difference between their facilities and their opportunities, they do have music at the elementary level. And so, even that would raise equity concerns for me. And another point I wanted to bring up too is, and I genuinely don't know. So let's say a vision impaired student wants to audition in Missouri, or a student that's completely blind. How does sight reading work for them?
So blind. I have an episode about this actually. You should go check out the episode
Okay.
with Ree Robinson, who is a blind choir teacher who teaches her kids to read music,
I know
and
her.
she thinks and she thinks it's a very important skill even for blind students, and has her own equity positions, of course, on why blind students shouldn't assume that they can't learn to read music, because there is braille music and it was taught to her, etc. So I won't speak for her, but I would check that out. And
Sure.
and so I think that yes, absolutely, I would be in support of whatever resources being on hand to make that an equitable audition. I think in Missouri we alter the audition, but I don't think that includes braille music reading, although I think that's something that obviously kids should have access to if it's something that they want to learn how to do. But honestly, I don't feel qualified to speak too much
Sure.
on that, because I don't
Well,
know,
and
I don't know a whole lot.
I'm genuinely
know a whole
just
lot about it.
asking because, that's a concern that I would raise if I was in a boardroom with the deciding board members, is how are we going to make accommodations? Because I think that's a huge concern for a lot of people. And it is for me as well. How are we going to accommodate students with dyslexia? How are we going to accommodate vision impaired students? And how are we going to make accommodations like every other subject has to make as well? So
Yeah, that's interesting. I think actually it kind of reminds me of the issue that we were talking about a second ago, which I'd like to go back to actually, of how do you assess the kid who slips into the wrong key, those types of things. And I think that, so I want to actually go back to that, because you were asking about it, and it's kind of applicable to this concept of making accommodations. Not all accommodations that students need in some contexts need to be given to those students in all contexts. So that's a big important thing. As a parent of an IEP student, I would be the first to remind people that not all accommodations are needed by those kids in every situation. And part of what the goal of many individual education plans is to get off of the individual education plan. Like
Yeah.
that is the goal is to move past it. It's what supports. It's almost like thinking of it like rungs of a ladder. Every single school year, my daughter's a senior now, or she will be. It has been okay. What supports can we take away this year? Like what supports from that she had in second grade are irrelevant now, that she doesn't need them anymore. Can we get rid of those? And sometimes the answer is, well, she really still needs this one. And then sometimes the answer is, you know what? She's fine. She can move past that now. And so that's why this is relevant. So, for example, when I'm assessing my ninth grade boy whose voice is changing, and maybe they can only sing and stay in the right key in the key of A flat because their voice just dropped an octave, and now the only do he can maintain is the A flat at the bottom of the bass clef, and he can only sing 4 notes, and he can sing A flat, B flat, C, and D flat. Like those are the only 4 that he can do accurately. So I'm modifying, even without an IEP, I'm modifying his sight reading factory exercises to include the notes that he can sing. But then at the same time, by the time he's a senior ready for his All-State audition, I would say that in that context, he should not be getting those modifications anymore because he is not ready for that, or he doesn't need those modifications anymore, number one. And number two, if he wants to be considered for those elite opportunities, then the work that starts in ninth grade needs to be, it's okay to tell a kid, if you want to achieve this, you're going to have to do this work. And that means being ready to sing an exercise where you stay in the same key or else you're not ready for All-State. And I think it's okay for us to say those types of things to kids. In fact, I think it's crucial that we do tell them those things.
I agree. And I think good gatekeeping to a certain degree is what keeps music excellent. And I do think there is, I tell my students all the time, I demand excellence because you are excellent. And I think as teachers, we need to always be doing things that are almost too hard for them or even too hard for them to a certain degree, so they reach for that. So I definitely would agree with you there. And I think, again, I keep coming back to Missouri All-State sounds very different than Alabama All-State. And I think there is a huge difference in what I see. And I would say a lot of Alabama teachers. In fact, I don't know personally any teacher, and I don't know there are out there, but every colleague of mine that I have spoken to agrees with me, and all of my colleagues do sight reading. They're big advocates of sight reading, had very fine programs, but everyone I've spoken to agrees with me. And the common denominator or the common factor is the school systems that we kind of teach in. Again, it just comes down to a difference of how we view All-State. Would you agree that part of what makes an excellent musician is being able to respond in the moment? I think you would agree to that, right? Respond.
Sure. I just don't know how possible that would be to assess in an audition.
Sure, and I agree with that. I think it would be impractical to a certain degree. If there was a way to add it, I would be a huge advocate about adding it. I guess to me, it's like if we had auditions where we said, okay, sing that again, but focus more on this dynamic, or push towards that word, or try to sing that with a darker sound. To me, that's more of an applicable skill for All-State itself than sight reading. That might be a hot take. So
I think what you've done is whether on purpose or not, you've gotten us to the crux of the disagreement, which is that I would disagree with you about whether or not the audition should be assessing specifically the things that happen at the festival. Right there would be the disagreement, because I see an audition for really any kind of high-level honor choir, whether it be your college's top choir or your high school's top choir or the all-state choir or whatever it is to find the best group of all around as much as you can assess reasonably and fairly choral musicians, specifically. The best people who sing in a choir, and what are those skills? And so for me, those skills essentially are the inner ear. Like, can you assess the student's ability to hear notes and rhythms happening in their head, and the evidence of that is, can I reproduce them? Right? Sure. Some kind of vocal technique, like the ability to sing in multiple parts of their voice, unify vocal registers, sing pure vowels, etc. and the ability to read music. Like those are all skills that kind of create in any professional context for real world choral music making. Those are skills that would be assessed. And so to me, that's what an all-state audition should be made of. And then you will also get a better all-state choir because those skills all show very important. In other words, if I can't pick up a piece of music, hear a starting pitch, and sing the line with no help, then being able to respond in the moment when music is changing and all the variables are changing of live rehearsal, I'm not going to be as good at that as a person who can read, because the reading is really just an evidence of what is happening in our brain, like what music is happening in our brain. I can see it and I can hear it happening, and then I can reproduce it. So to me, it's not really about what specific activities are happening there. It's about, are we rewarding the teaching of that well-rounded skill of the inner ear, the vocal technique, and the reading ability. Those to me are what make an all-state musician or a top-level choral musician. Thoughts about that?
Yeah. And yeah, I see your point, and I agree. It should be, and I think, again, it just comes down to what we think the evaluation should be. And I think I try to be very mission driven in how I teach, and that's something my mentor Adam Paltrowitz really pushes, is being mission driven. And for me, my mission is not, and I'm sure you would agree with this, and I'm not saying that because we disagree on one thing you don't believe this. I'm just saying, for me, music education and teaching students is not just about creating professional musicians or extremely high achieving musicians. For me, it's about instilling a love of music in my students. And I think one thing I wanted to bring up was a particular comment on my Facebook post, actually from the agricultural teacher here in our school, a really great guy. He and I work well together. And he commented and said how he was in All-State and said, I would not have been able to make All-State if sight reading was part of it, or my score would have been significantly less. But he went on to talk about how meaningful that experience was to him, and it's something he's taken into his life and will never forget. And then he actually, is an advocate for choral music in his program. He encourages students to join choir. They have an FCA quartet that he wants me to head up or help him head up. And I think for me, All-State and just choir in general is about instilling that lifelong love of choral music. Whether they become, I would love if every graduating class I had one or two that went on to be professional musicians. I think that would be wonderful. But also, more importantly to me, I want my students to be graduating with the choral experience and a love for choral music, and looking back on it as that fantastic memory, and being able to listen back to their recordings of All-State. And again, I want to hasten to add, I don't think you don't believe that at all. And I'm sure you would agree with a lot of what I said about the sentiment of...
No, I agree with all that.
Yeah.
I agree with all that. And I would only add to it. I wouldn't subtract to it. I agree with all that. I just think that the best way to get the best way to get the largest number of kids to have a lifelong love and appreciation of music is to teach them to be good at it. There is, like, the kids who quit, and this is borne out in all kinds of research over many disciplines, not just music. Kids quit stuff when they feel like they suck at it. Okay. And yeah. There are always going to be stories of a person who, like the teacher that you mentioned, who maybe didn't learn a particular skill, but they still got to participate in the activity, etc. But I would just say that those are anecdotes, and in the bigger picture of things, that when we are teaching, we should be choosing what we advocate for pedagogically for what is going to give the greatest good to the greatest number of kids. And in programs that don't prioritize teaching reading not as the only thing they teach, and just like in All-State, I don't think it should be the only thing assessed. And I think that sometimes we start to focus on, but some kids don't know how to read. It's right. One of many things that we're assessing is that, but when we have programs that don't prioritize that at all, we actually end up prioritizing the kids who have the most natural musical ability, because they're the ones who can pick up a tune, hear it, and recreate it. We are actually excluding all the kids who need the explicit instruction that reading gives them. And so for every anecdote of that teacher that you have, I have from my own teaching experience, hundreds of anecdotes of kids who walked in my classroom in ninth grade with almost no ability to carry a tune at all, and then have gone all the way through the rigorous Missouri All-State Choir process and made All-State Choir because I taught them to read. And they were not talented. They were not the star in ninth grade. They were not the nobody would have given them a solo in middle school. It was through that confidence building process. So I just think that's why I advocate for this so strongly, is because I think we sometimes prioritize in choral music education. We oftentimes prioritize the kid who's brave and has a pretty voice, and in places that don't assess reading for All-State, those kids continue to get recognized. And in the systems that I advocate for, the shy kid who doesn't really sing out very confidently,
Sure.
once they learn some of these other skills, can also become one of the All-Staters. And so that's why I would only caution in this conversation folks to think that to remind themselves that there are equity concerns on both sides of this argument.
No, I see that.
And that's, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, something I'm passionate about is choral music is a very different skill set than solo singing. Someone that wants to go on and be a professional choral musician, they might be a fantastic soloist, but they might just want to be a choir, not just, but might want to be in choir. And that's a very different skill set, I would argue, than being a solo musician. And that's something I struggled with in college. Is I had a naturally more soloistic voice. I was involved in opera, and I had trouble in choir a lot of times. Choir would make my voice more tired because I was used to soloistic singing. So I do agree with you on the equity issue of we need to not just recognize soloists or naturally pretty voiced students, but also getting those students who are good choral musicians, who respond well in the moment, who work hard and learn their music. But I can think of one very particular student that I have. She is fantastic alto, wonderful student, wonderful choral musician. She never wants a solo. She does not want it. She will not do it, and she absolutely could if she wanted to, but she is much more comfortable singing in choir. And sadly, she's one of the ones who told me that she's not, and she's actually a great sight reader. She told me she's not going to do it if sight reading's a part of it. And I think she will, and I think I can convince her to. But I think that's kind of where my opinions on it came from, is seeing the concern my students have about that. So and again, the only thing we can do is, the only thing I can control is what I can control. And what I can control is that I'm going to really push sight reading even more next year. And that will be my teaching response to it. But that doesn't necessarily change what my kind of philosophical response to it is, if that makes sense. So,
sure. Yeah, no, yeah. I totally understand. And I appreciate your time discussing this. One other thing I really appreciate is just your willingness to put thoughts out there, which I think is very rare. You talked about the difference between theater teachers and choir teachers. That is, in a lot of ways, we are a risk-averse or a conflict-averse group in many ways. And so that is very brave to put your thoughts out there, and even more brave to come on and discuss this, knowing that we don't agree on all of it. And so I really applaud, especially at your young age, your willingness to do this. So David, thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.